Homeless man helps woman pay for pizza. Police approach him the next day. Her eyes were downcast as the cashier talked to her. As someone who'd been through many challenges, the man knew something was off immediately. He didn't have much on him, only a few bucks meant to see him through the day. It was still mid-morning and he knew he'd go hungry by helping her, but he didn't mind, if only he knew who she was. But the man hadn't thought about stepping in when he saw the woman walk into the diner. She was drenched in rainwater, her hair soaking as she ducked into the establishment. She recoiled as the cashier spoke to her, her needy eyes heavy with tears. The man knew he couldn't just sit and watch, he had to step in. It had been a typical rainy day for the folks of Lindsborg, Kansas. Pouring rain had soaked the town amidst the onset of fall, turning the usually bright town into a duller version of itself. A homeless man sat huddled outside a diner, his tattered clothes clinging to his frail frame. A quiet individual, he rarely got in anyone's way, but that would change real soon. The frozen air and chilly winds had been the man's constant companions for the past few days since the rain started. The meager $3 he'd collected over the past 2 days represented his only lifeline, and he hoped it would help him survive whatever harsh conditions the world was conjuring up. He had no clue who was about to step into the diner. As he sat there gazing longingly at the patrons inside the cozy diner, he couldn't help but think of the difficult days he'd endured. The memories of lost jobs, estranged family, and a series of unfortunate events that had brought him to this point weighed heavily on his mind. If he could go back in time and change everything, he would. But now things were so bad that the only thing he could do was sit here and hope someone would take pity on him and help. But Caleb Hayes hadn't thought he'd end up there. Things had gone awry during the pandemic, landing him in crippling debt that had thrown him out on the streets. For months he'd tried to get back on his feet, but nothing seemed to work. Every day he'd come here and sit. His cup in hand, he'd ask passers-by for some change, anything to get him through the week. That day, the rain had stolen the day from everyone in town. Caleb's eyes wandered inside the diner, scanning the faces of those enjoying a warm meal. That's when he noticed her, a woman with her head hung low at the counter, her features etched with worry. He couldn't help but empathize, recognizing the familiar signs of hardship in her posture. The woman, seemingly in her early 20s, seemed distressed. Caleb's compassionate heart stirred within him. Despite the judgmental eyes of the diner's customers upon him, he decided to investigate. Pushing open the diner's door, he was met with a chorus of curious stares, but he pressed forward, drawn by a compelling urge to help the woman in need. Caleb had long believed that helping someone never cost you a thing. It didn't matter what the gesture was. It could be something as simple as cooking them a meal or a grand gesture like helping them mow a lawn. A good deed costs nothing, he always said. Making people's day better, even by a single percentage, is better than leaving them to deal with their trouble alone. He had no idea that today his good deed would cost him everything he had. As he approached the counter, he overheard her conversation with the cashier. It was clear that she didn't have enough cash to cover the cost of her pizza. The manager, Michael, an imposing figure with crossed arms, was growing impatient. He pointedly told the homeless man to leave, eager to rid the establishment of this unwelcome presence. However, before the homeless man could comply, he reached into his cup and pulled out 3 crumpled dollar bills. Ignorant of the woman's identity, he handed them to the cashier and said, "I'll cover her pizza." The manager raised an eyebrow, taken aback by this unexpected act of kindness from someone society had largely forgotten. With a reluctant nod, he agreed to let the woman keep her pizza, and the homeless man retreated outside, his heart warmed by the small act of compassion he just performed. His mind drifted away from the encounter, and he didn't even notice it when the woman walked out of the diner. His day continued on, with the rain still pelting the town. Nightfall came, and Caleb collected his belongings and left his spot. Although he didn't have any cash for dinner, he was glad that the girl hadn't starved that day. If only he knew she'd already gone to the authorities to report his actions. That night, as Caleb settled under a bridge on the other side of town, far from the prying eyes of the diner's patrons, he drifted into a restless sleep. He'd barely had a good night's sleep since being evicted from his home 3 months ago. Accosted by the harsh elements, constant danger from animals and people who were up to no good, and nightmares from his past mistakes, his sleeping experience was the worst, but tonight it would be different. Caleb had just fallen asleep when his slumber was abruptly shattered by the harsh, unwelcome presence of 2 uniformed officers. They looked at him like he was a lost dog, their eyes brimming with pity, and asked him to rise to his feet. One of the officers informed him they needed to take him away, his voice firm. "Please come quietly, sir," he said. Being a law-abiding citizen, Caleb complied. His mind raced with confusion and anxiety. He hopped into the back of the officer's cruiser, his hands trembling as they drove off into the night. Caleb had never had any run-ins with the officers. Even when he was in debt, he tried his hardest to settle them before the loan companies involved the authorities. He feared them as much as he respected them. The drive was long and quiet, peppered with a little small talk. The officers wanted to know more about Caleb and why he ended up on the streets. He told him an abridged version of the story. After the pandemic hit 3 years ago, his business as a food cart owner and chef fell. He fell into debt trying to revive it and lost everything, but that wasn't the worst part. Caleb's daughter, a 23-year-old named Sasha, got infected with a virus and sadly passed away. All these misfortunes hit at the same time, and Caleb's wife, who with Sasha had been his everything, cut ties with him. Caleb had been living from motel to motel for more than a year after that, but soon he ran out of money to support that lifestyle and found himself on the streets without anything to his name. He still couldn't believe that he'd lost everything so quickly. Caleb was surprised to find out how attentive and supportive the officers were. They offered words of comfort, asking him to keep his head up. One of them, Officer Roddy, even offered his phone number, telling Caleb he had a few clothes he could give him. But although the officers were good to Caleb, it was evident they were hiding something monumental. There was an eerie air between the officers, as if something was about to happen. They kept looking at Caleb through the rearview mirror, seemingly studying him. Caleb had asked them several times when they were taking him, but none of them answered. They were vague with their responses, which only made everything more weird. Caleb's heart started thumping as he realized he might have messed up. When they woke him up, he didn't ask to see their officers' badges and willingly entered their vehicle. For all he knew, they might have been dangerous people masquerading as the law. The more Caleb entertained this idea, the more water it held. There was something odd at work here, and Caleb couldn't pinpoint it, but everything would make sense soon enough. The drive didn't last long. Soon they arrived back at the diner. Caleb froze in place as his eyes landed on the woman he'd helped before. There, in the company of an older man, she stood quietly. She pointed directly at him even before he got out of the cruiser, her voice trembling with a mix of emotions. That's him," she said, her gaze fixed on Caleb. The older man, her father, looked at Caleb with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. His reaction caught Caleb by surprise. His mind had been racing with questions. He was sure he was in trouble, even though he couldn't say for what. The man before him wore a bespoke suit and stood under an expensive-looking umbrella. It didn't take long for Caleb to figure out who he was. His heart stopped beating immediately. The man stepped forward and extended a hand. "The rains are not yet done with the night," he said matter-of-factly, and in a thick southern accent said, "Ride with us." Caleb looked around, trembling in the night's chill. The parking lot they stood in was empty and the diner closed. He knew he didn't have any other choice here but to follow the man's instructions. Shaking his hand, he agreed to his request. The man in turn thanked the officers for bringing Caleb to him. The officers tipped their caps and returned to their cruiser, driving off. It was then the man spoke freely. He introduced himself as Robert, a businessman from town. "Thank you for helping my daughter when she needed it most," he said sincerely. But Caleb, now aware of the woman's identity and her family's wealth, felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him. He stammered out an explanation, sharing that even though he was going through something himself, he wouldn't let that bar him from doing what he knew was right. But helping the man's daughter wasn't a reason to ask him to step into his car. But Robert would hear none of it. He insisted on offering Caleb a place to stay for the night, a warm meal, and an opportunity to change the course of his life. Over the next few weeks, they would come to know each other better, and Caleb would learn about the complexities of Robert's family. Robert, a successful businessman, had a kind and compassionate heart, which Caleb learned was much like his daughter Emily, who just started her first year of college. She'd found herself in a tough situation that day without any money or way to contact home. Caleb's help had gone a long way in helping her, and she'd sworn to help him in any way possible. She told her dad about the encounter as soon as they talked, unaware of what he'd do. Robert, who had several connections in town, pulled a few strings, securing Caleb an interview for a cooking position in one of the best restaurants in town. At first, Caleb was hesitant to accept this gift. It was too much. He'd grown used to the hardships of life on the streets, where the only constants were uncertainty and solitude. But as the days passed, he came to appreciate the gesture. He even opened up about losing his daughter and wife during the pandemic, which brought him closer to Robert's family. But this was only the start. Robert and his family offered Caleb a studio apartment on the city's outskirts, which is under their name. Although it was neither big nor posh, it was cozy and homey, a far cry from what Caleb had been used to in the streets. They visited him constantly and invited him out whenever he wasn't working at his new cooking job. Caleb couldn't believe that all this had come from his decision to help someone in need. As weeks turned into months, Caleb became integral to Robert and Emily's lives. He found true friends in them and continued to grow professionally and as a person. He talked to Robert about wanting to start his business again. He shared that for him, the end game would be to own a restaurant where food was affordable as it was delicious. "I want it to be a place where people won't be chased away because they can't pay for their slice of pizza," he said. He was left speechless by Robert's response. Robert was on board with Caleb's idea, even asking to invest in it. It had been a year since they met, and Caleb had progressed in his cooking career, becoming a sous chef in the restaurant he'd started in. He revealed that he'd saved cash from the job, enough to get him his own place and put him through culinary school. He hoped to show Robert that he and Emily didn't make a mistake, having faith in him.